Hi, you're listening to The Dive, brought to you by Living Word Press, starting right now. Hi, welcome back to Season 2 of The Dive. I'm back with Dr. Josh Waltman, Dr. Gary Yates. We had an interesting question come in about the Canaanite conquest and genocide. And so we're going to break this out into a few episodes. So episode 1 on kind of this series, Can God Commit an Evil Act? Dad, I'll throw it to you first.
Okay, good to see you guys. And it's been a while since we've been in the studio here.
I don't like the mirror in front of us, though, I have to say. Man,
you'll notice why I'm sitting over a little to the left here, so I don't. No, great to be with you guys, and I keep bringing us back to all these Old Testament God questions, but I do think this goes along with the discussion that we had. We talked about Uzzah and the ark, and is God an instant executioner, and kind of irrational in his anger there. Then what do we do with a messenger of God like Elisha commanding the bears to come down and maul these children? But an even larger issue than those does deal with this question of God commanding the Israelites, to wipe out the Canaanites or to exterminate them or to commit genocide against them. But I think in this episode we need to think about just some philosophical questions. And first of all is just as humans, we have to struggle with the idea: how do we determine the difference between what is good and evil in terms of making a moral assessment about an action and that sort of thing? So, Josh, where do we even begin to think about that?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. I mean, goodness gracious. In more Christian apologetics, we would talk about the moral argument for God's existence, and then obviously in ethics and philosophy, there's always this question floating around out there called the grounding question. How do we ground morality? What is it based in? What is it rooted in? And for Christians, what we would want to say is that it's always rooted in the character of God and who God is, his attributes, his nature. Who is God? That is the very source of all that is good, holy, righteous, and just. And so if God himself is good, holy, righteous, and just, then we would want to sort of sidestep some of these theories out there that would want to, sort of paint God as one that is subservient to an outside source of morality, or that somehow what God has said or has decreed is good just because he said or decreed it. It's not those ideas. It's that God himself is good, okay? And because he is good, what he says and decrees and his actions, those things that he does, all of those things are good. And so, again, it's not something outside of God that's being imposed on him, but rather from within, from his very self, is where we find goodness. And so, just in dealing with goodness, obviously we're in a culture, in a society that's trying to find the answer to that question of where do we ground morality. We look to a variety of other places. Is it found in government or legislation? Is it found in, what we sort of think, or I'm going to use the word intuit, our moral intuition? Is it based on what sort of rises up from what we feel? We would say as Christians, no, it's not based on any of those other things. Ultimately, goodness, morality is rooted in God himself. And if we find it in anything else, there's going to be a failure. And so to frame up any of these questions about the Canaanite, quote unquote, genocide, or however we want to frame that, and I think we're going to talk about that in detail here in the next couple of episodes. To frame up any of that, we have to start with this notion that God himself is the source of goodness.
Yeah, and part of the problem for us as humans is God. We are created by God. God has, he's put his moral conscience, within us so that we can apprehend what is good and evil. But as a result of the fall, our thinking and our consciences have deviated from what God implanted within us. And that affects our ability to assess and evaluate the morality of things as well, right?
Yeah, it's barriers or obstacles that we have in assessing morality, and obviously more than a couple, but I'll mention a couple here. And one is what you just said. We've got this, in theology, we call it the noetic effects of the fall, and the way that the fall, the brokenness of sin, has changed the way that we think. and it's sort of seeped into how we evaluate things. And a lot of times we're not even aware of how this has challenged our thinking. So there's that problem. And then secondarily, we have the issue that we're finite creatures. We don't have all the information. We ourselves are very limited. And so you put those two things together, and there are some significant barriers to being able to determine ultimately what is right and good. And, a lot of times, we talked about this before this episode a little bit. A lot of times what people will want to do is they'll want to use like analogies. They'll want to say, well, God must be a good father, as the song goes. And I love that song, by the way. But what we often think about is like, what makes for a good earthly father? That must be how God is in heaven. And in some ways that's true, the analogy works, but in some ways not so much, because our earthly father isn't the creator, and he's not the source of all that is good, holy, righteous, and just. And so the relationship is different on some level. And so the example I give in some of my classes is, does God possess courage? Well, no, because he doesn't have any fear. He doesn't fear anything, so he doesn't need to be quote unquote brave in and of himself. So I would say no, he doesn't have courage, but we would think of his courage as something that the ultimate man must have. Well, no, that's in an earthly perspective, but from a heavenly perspective, God doesn't need that to truly be great. And so the same works with morality. What our evaluation is being filtered often through the noetic effects of the fall, which should produce some skepticism about our evaluation of that which is good, but also the very fact that we're very limited in our perspective, not having all the variables about what is justified when it comes to, say, violence, for instance.
Well, and then to complicate that,
Yeah.
When you take the noetic fall, the effects of the fall on an individual, and then multiply that through an entire culture, then there are cultural biases and prejudices. And I do think, part of this discussion with God and violence, our modern sensibilities end up bleeding into this quite a bit.
How
right?
so? What do you think?
Well, I think just the idea that violence is we're so detached from that.
Yeah.
Whereas, death and war and, definitely in the ancient Near East, but even our great grandfathers and things would have been much more in touch with that. And so I think some of that affects the way that we assess how we read these texts.
You're right. Our culture has sanitized so much of that.
We don't even have to. We don't even have to kill our chickens.
Well, I was just
dinner,
sitting here
so
thinking, it's one of the first time I ever gut a deer, and I'm getting off into the weeds here, I guess. But I was like, man, wow, I am reminded of the fall here. And this is not something that I don't normally have to slaughter my meat, but having to do that, I'm reminded of how gory it really is. Right. And in our first world, 2024 America, we don't have to touch a lot of that. Whereas it's still a real fact of life.
Yeah, and in the Old Testament, there are like 400 references, I think, to war and that sort of thing. So it was much more a part of life and culture and just a commonly accepted part of life.
Yeah,
and we have to realize that that creates some tensions for us as we go back and try to read these texts. This raises the question too about, we've touched on this a little bit, divine command, and that being a way of kind of working through this issue. What exactly does divine command say in terms of thinking about the conquest? And then what are some strengths and maybe some weaknesses with that?
Yeah, and so I'm definitely overly simplifying here, but just the gist of what some of our brothers and sisters would say about this with divine command, it's just this idea that something is good by virtue of God simply saying or decreeing it to be so. So if God says to go kill the Canaanites, then it's good.
It's good.
It's good because He said so. Now, again, the issue here is, at least a distinction that I would want to make, I guess I would say, is we know that it's good by virtue of God telling us to do it, that it's a justified act, we might say.
Because we know who God is and what God's
like. But it's not necessarily good just because He said to do it. In other words, He couldn't have told them to do something evil, per se, and then just call it good and slap goodness on it like it's a label at Walmart or something like that, right? Again, our definition has to constantly go back to, well, goodness stems from who God is in Himself. He is the source of objective goodness. And so he reveals himself, he gives instructions as an outflow of who he is. But it's not good just because he said it per se. It's good because of who he is. Right. And that's the distinction here. And we would say, yeah, ultimately, God's commands are good, but not just because he said it.
Yeah, I would say the same thing about God's word being truthful.
Yeah.
God has said that he's true. I believe that God is truthful. So what he says is truthful, not just because he said it, but
Right.
because that's the kind of God that he is. And so I can't always sort through all of the
Right.
the moral ambiguities and complexities of all this. But when the Bible says that God is loving and just and merciful and holy, then somehow this command that he's given fits within those attributes.
Yeah, and that's right. I think that's in part why our culture really is very sensitive to this particular issue with Canaanite quote unquote genocide. It's if you don't start with a biblical conception of God or even the existence of God, if you're just dealing with this issue, then it's hard to understand. Like, we're trusting what's being told to us in part on the basis of our understanding of who God is fundamentally and how he's revealed himself. And like, we start from that lens and then we read this other through that lens. Now, there's some other, I think we're gonna find in the discussion, and I'm sure you're gonna bring this out in the next couple of episodes. There's some other rationale and justification for why this, even without necessarily looking at the attributes of God per se, why we would think this would be a justified act. But still, one of the reasons that it doesn't bother me as much, I would say, is because I already trust in who God is. Right? That's my very benchmark for goodness is who he is.
And I think that's part of what we want to see as our job is we want to try to help Christians to understand this and how do we approach this from a biblical perspective. We are not going to be able to provide answers to skeptics and new atheists and people that are not theists. They're not watching us anyway. I don't.
Oh,
think.
Brett is. Brett already told me that's exactly what he's trying to do.
Yeah, but I think understanding for people that do have that biblical frame of reference. How do we see this within the character of God that we know is revealed in Scripture?
Yeah, maybe just to speak to what you said just a second ago, I do think Christians can answer this as an objection from the culture, but it's not going to come in the form of a meme. Like it's going to take...
Or a slam dunk argument.
Yeah, it's not a slam dunk either, because we're talking about entire frameworks of morality here that we're going to sort of disagree on, and that we've got to take a step back and have an hour and a half conversation with people before we can even get on the same page. And that's why I think this is one of those issues. It's like, okay, if you think to yourself, you're going to resolve this with your atheist friend in a 5-minute dialogue on Facebook, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah. And I'm not an expert on divine command either. I think one of the struggles that I have with that, first of all, it does remind us of God's sovereignty. That God is the one who decrees and commands all things. But I do think in the Bible that God's justice and God's righteousness becomes a model for how humans are to act.
Right.
So the Lord delivers Israel out of bondage in Egypt. So therefore they are to treat their slaves with kindness and goodness. If we simply move God's actions into the realm of divine command, God said it and that settles it, I think it diminishes sort of the example of God's righteousness and justice in some ways.
Yeah, I think so.
As we're thinking how to practice.
Well,
that.
God's command isn't cold and calculated. It's based on like the shape of who he is as a person, right? And so I think that's something like you don't want to sever the character of his person from his command and the way that he reveals himself. You never want to do that. Yeah.
Well, I'll close this discussion out with one caveat, and Brett, anything that you want to throw in. We are not going to solve this problem. And
Speak for yourself.
We recognize the element of mystery that's here.
For sure.
And there's aspects of God's reasons and purposes behind this that you and I can't sit down in this studio and just elaborate all of that.
Right.
We recognize that, but at the same time, I do think that there is a biblical rationale. And when you approach the Bible with what I would call a hermeneutic of affirmation rather than a hermeneutic of suspicion or a hermeneutic of faith, I think those answers do ultimately makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, and I was joking a second ago,
Right.
of course, but I do think that there are satisfying answers here that will help the Christian that's maybe struggling with this because of some doubt or something that's going on. And we're going to get into that in the next episode. But ultimately, yeah, we have intellectually satisfying answers, but we're going to have to ultimately put our faith in the Lord first and foremost. It's faith seeking understanding, if you will.
Yeah.
And I think we get the benefit as New Testament Christians reading the Old Testament. We can be really individually focused, and also we have a very short time here. So
That's right.
I think we also have to think about God has overseen thousands and thousands of years, and
That's
these
right.
decisions are being fulfilled, sometimes much later than our lifespans. And fortunately, we get to see Jesus be the fulfillment of the Old Testament, but some of the jury's still out on some things that we see in our own lives. So,
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yep.
all right, thank you guys. We'll be back, so stay with us as we continue this conversation, and we'll see you next week. So thanks for diving in with us.
Thank you.